Baseball, man. I mean, it's just a hard game. It's hard to stay hot for 162 games, and we were just hoping that, we knew we weren't playing our best baseball coming into the postseason, but we were hoping once the lights turned on, we'd flip the switch and our offense would get back going, and it just didn't happen for us.
JT Realmuto, we just wanted to flip the switch. Didn't happen for us. Sports Bash live, 97.3 ESPN, the 97.3 ESPN free mobile app. Powered by First Bank of Seattle and streaming live video on the X platform at Mike Gill Show, on YouTube at Mike Gill Show. Subscribe to the show. Scott Lauber covers the Phillies for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He's set to join us in the 3 o'clock hour, which is brought to you by Broadleaf's Plumbing, Heating, and Air Conditioning, your trusted source for heating, plumbing service, and installation for generations. 609-390-3907. Online at broadleafs.net. Well, the Phillies like to flush this one down the toilet. It was an awful series all the way around. Plenty of blame from top to bottom. And Scott Lauber's here to give us some insight. He's been around this team for years. You've been around, Scott, this group for years. Have they hit their ceiling? Is this team, as constructed with this core, maxed out?
Hey, Mike, no, I don't think they're maxed out. First of all, they're all going to be back next year. The core I'm talking about, Harper, Turner, Realmuto, Schwarber, Castellanos, Wheeler, Nola. I mean, the group is under contract again for another year altogether. And they're going to take another run at this thing. Now, there are going to be changes made around that group. And I think more changes this year than there were last year when they really ran back the entire roster. And they are all going to be a year older. And so each time they go through this and they don't get all the way, they don't go all the way, they don't win the World Series, it represents a missed opportunity because they come back a year later and they're all a year older and it gets a little harder every time. But no, I don't think they're maxed out. I think they have another run or two or three left in them. But there is going to have to be a whole lot of digging in on what went wrong and why this team was a 500 team from the end of the London trip until now. I mean, they were 45-19 after they won that first game against the Mets in London. And I think I'm thinking a lot about London because it ended against the Mets. And, of course, they played the Mets in London. So you sort of think about where they were then. But really, if you go back, they were 45-19 after that first game in London. They were 51, I believe it's 51-50 after that, including this postseason series. So a 500 team since like June 9th or whatever that was, that's a long time to be a 500 team, and they're better than that. So they have to figure out why they started out so hot and ended up so ordinary.
I started at that point because I want to kind of work backwards here because there is a lot of things that obviously happened in this series. He goes to Hoffman, and everybody, why stick with Hoffman? I mean, I think it's a fair question, but I don't know that the cognitive answer comes out of who else was he trusting in that moment. I mean, Hoffman got 2 outs, and he figured, oh, my God, I finally got somebody out. Should I just stick with them? I mean, obviously that's a moment in the game. What did you think? Were you surprised he stuck with Hoffman to go back out there?
No, I wasn't. I don't know if it was the right move or not, but I wasn't surprised he made it. I mean, look, Jeff Hoffman, I watched the guy all year, and really until his last outing in Washington, second to last game of the year, was lights out all year long. There was nothing down the stretch even to really indicate that he was tired or that he was, that they used him up or that, he wasn't going to have something left for the postseason. A bad outing, his last regular season outing against Washington, it meant nothing. It was a meaningless game, so you're like, okay, flush that. Then he blows up in game 1 and, bad timing. But I don't know that you run from him because of that, because, again, like I said, I didn't really see it down the stretch like, oh, there are warning signs for this. I guess you could question whether he should have come back with Hoffman in the 6th after Hoffman gets them out of the 5th. It's funny. That's the way he used them a lot of last year, was to kind of be the guy to come in a messy situation and clean it up. And Hoffman did that really well last year and sort of used that as a springboard to kind of become one of their, if not their best late inning guy, one of their 2 or 3 best late inning guys all year. So he cleans up Suarez's mess in the 5th. and he comes back out for the 6th. I didn't have a huge problem with it. In fact, the times that Rob Thompson sort of left me scratching my head during this series were the times where he strayed from kind of the consistent guy that he is. Like, Rob Thompson all year long is Mr., I'm not changing my lineup because I want to show them that I have confidence in them, and I'm not going to drop this guy, or I'm not going to raise up that guy, or I'm going to keep things steady. I'm going to be even-keeled. And then all of a sudden, he's benching Alec Boehm in Game 2, and he's starting Christopher Sanchez in Game 2 instead of Aaron Nola, which I know worked out in the end, but I thought was a kind of an eyebrow-raising move, at least for me. He was juggling left fielders. I think they had 3 or 4 different left fielders in the series. So those were some of the moves that kind of caught my attention. Stott and Marsh don't play in Game 3 against the lefty, but they play in Game 4. So it was some of that had me raising my eyebrows, not so much the sticking with the guys who got you there, because, like I said, Hoffman I thought was really good down the stretch, but for that last outing in Washington, and I didn't really see anything that said, oh, boy, this guy's got nothing left for the postseason.
Scott, I don't know how you feel, but it almost feels like Thompson got a little, last year he went to Kimbrel and got blasted for it. And then he was like, you know what? No one's getting anybody out, so I'm just going to stick with Hoffman because he got 2 guys out. Because he couldn't try. It felt like he just completely didn't know what to do because Strom let him down. Alvarado completely, let him down. Hoffman let him down. And then Esteves, he used 25 pitches inexplainably the night before. So I guess he figured, look, I'm facing the bottom of their lineup. I got my best guy out there. He got 2 outs in the 5th. I got to roll with him here. So it was almost like he's damned if he does and he's damned if he doesn't in that spot there. And I say this all the time. People love to blame the manager. Thompson deserves some blame, but he's managing through others' flaws, and then that brings out your own. And because he lost trust in what he had, I think he just stuck with Hoffman because he got 2 guys out in the 5th.
Yeah, I mean, look, I got to tell you, too, I know that the narrative going in was that they had this lights-out bullpen. And I think we've talked about it on this show. I know I've written about it and talked about it in other places too, that it was a good bullpen. It wasn't a great bullpen. There was an argument to be made that even last year's bullpen was better than this year's. At least it was deeper. They got to, the postseason and they had 5 guys that they really trusted. It was Hoffman, Strom, Alvarado, Kerkering, and Esteves, right? And, they went to the trade deadline. I'll take you back even further, right? They went to the trade deadline, and it was like, well, they got to improve the bullpen. So they pick up, they trade for Esteves, terrific, great, but they also traded away Dominguez. Soto was sort of addition by subtraction, and they replaced him with Tanner Banks, who was whatever. He was a lefty who filled the role. But to me, I know Sir Anthony Dominguez wasn't like Mr. Trustworthy here toward the end. But he was a guy that factored into that late inning mix.
Yep.
And so not only did they trade him, but then they get Esteves. They kind of netted out, if anything. They didn't really add to the bullpen. So I sort of felt like, okay, he's got 5 really good options, and that really ought to be good. But, the way they use bullpens in the postseason, you really can't have enough. And in some ways, you go back to last offseason, Kimbrel walks away. Nobody was sad to see that happen, but they didn't replace Kimbrel. To me, Esteves kind of stepped into the Kimbrel role from last year. And again, you've sort of netted out because you don't have Dominguez anymore. And, I didn't think the bullpen was as deep as it was last year. And I think in the end it showed. I mean, they didn't pitch well. Hoffman didn't pitch well. Strom didn't pitch well. Kerkering didn't pitch well. Esteves didn't pitch well. But on top of all of that, I thought he had fewer options than he had last year.
Right, and listen, I think it's a great point with Dominguez. I brought this up a lot, is that you brought Hayes. It feels like they overvalued what they were getting from Hayes, and then he gets hurt, and it's not his fault, and the whole kidney thing. But I think they thought they were getting this guy that was going to be an everyday player, and you essentially gave up last night Dominguez I was thinking about it. This is where Dominguez could have gone in this game. He probably would have been the guy maybe that was warming up in the 2nd inning instead of Hoffman, or maybe – but you're right. They were kind of a guy short there, and that goes to what you said. They used 3 left fielders. They were complacent at the deadline the last 2 years with a right-handed bat. Rodolfo Castro last year and this year Hayes. Was that a decision that hindsight, looking back on, that they regret?
I mean, look, I think Austin Hayes is a good player. I don't know that he was the answer, even had he stayed healthy, but I think he's a good player, and I understand what they did, and I understand why they did it. They looked at him and they said this guy was an all-star last year on a good team. He got into a situation this year where the Orioles had a ton of young outfielders who they wanted to play. Hayes had lost a lot of playing time. They thought, okay, well, we can take this guy who's undervalued in Baltimore, and he can help us. Now, he wasn't going to be, Juan Soto or anything like that, but they sort of decided that what they wanted was a marginal upgrade. There wasn't a player out there that they viewed as a guy who would be a huge upgrade. So, I mean, look, we'll never know because he didn't stay healthy and ended up not being able to be the guy. But I mean, he came over in the trade, and my first impression was, okay, he'll platoon with Marsh. Mm-hmm. And then they talked about, oh no, we want to see Austin Hayes play every day. And that was their full intention. They wanted to do that. They wanted to let that go for a while and see how that looked. And then he strains his hamstring like 10 games in. And that's really as long as the look got, because after the hamstring, you had the kidney infection, which really, really knocked him for a loop. And then, he just was never really able to kind of get back out there. So we'll never know. I mean, it'll go down as a bad trade deadline, I suppose, but we'll just never know what he could have done because he wasn't on the field.
Scott Lauber from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Obviously so many moments in this series that, happened. The sixth inning from Game 3 where they have 2 on and they can't get anything there. That's just a microcosm of what this offense has kind of been over the last couple of years when they go through these streaks. And then you mentioned the core should be back or will be back. That's contractually obligated. They're obligated to a lot of these guys contractually, but if they are to make some tweaks and some changes to this roster, is there a drastic decision they can make, or are you like, hey, we got Real Muto, we have Harper, we have Stott, we've got Turner, we've got Bohm, we've got Marsh, we've got Rojas, we've got Schwarber, and we have Castellanos, and they're all back, and there's not much we can do about it?
No, I don't think that they're that tied to all of those guys you just mentioned. I mean, I wrote something that's up on the Inquirer's website right now, and I think what I'm most interested in is looking at some of the guys underneath the core, the high-priced core that they're locked into. I'm talking about Marsh, Bohm, Stott. On the pitching side, a guy like Ranger Suarez. I mean, what's really interesting to me with the way the season ended and the way a lot of those guys played either toward the end or all season long is that, Stott and Marsh regressed, I thought, from the start of the season to the end. Obviously, Ranger Suarez's second half was really, really not good. He was injured. He was the best pitcher in baseball in the first half. And like Alec Bohm, kind of like takes a step back toward the end. Is it related to his hand and the injury that he had? Is it more than that? I just, I think you got to take a sort of a harder look at maybe that group and figure out, like, are they all part of the long-term plan? And if not, like, is there a way to swap a guy out to get somebody? So like just to use an example, I think Brandon Marsh is fascinating because at this point in time, it looks like he's a platoon outfielder, which is not the worst thing in the world, although it's not what they intended when they traded for him. They thought they were getting a center fielder who was going to be an everyday guy and a piece of their future. He doesn't look like he can hit lefties, at least not right now, so he's a platoon outfielder. So you say, okay, fine, could do worse than that if you get a better outfielder on the other end of the platoon. But the thing about Brandon Marsh is he swings and misses a lot. His whole team swings and misses a lot. I wonder if you could flip Brandon Marsh and replace him with somebody who could complement the core a little bit better than he does in terms of skill set, in terms of what he brings at the plate. A guy maybe who makes a lot more contact. A guy who maybe helps you you hear that pass the baton phrase over and over again, like we just got to pass the baton. Well, the Phillies aren't very good at passing the baton because they don't make enough contact and they don't have enough diversity, so to speak, throughout their lineup. A lot of them are very similar hitters. So I wonder if you look at a guy like Marsh and you're like, well, we're getting about as much as we're going to get out of this guy, which is fine. if he fit into the lineup a little bit better, he doesn't fit into the lineup all that well. So maybe you flip him and you find somebody who complements the group a little bit more. I think that's what they're going to have to look at. I think that's what they're going to have. I think that they're going to have to make some decisions on guys like that and figure out, can we get better, or do we, who can we swap out to get better, and who do we keep for the long term?
Yeah, it's obviously the outfield was a problem, Scott, the whole season. I mean, Castellanos got pretty steady over the last half of the year, probably a little bit more than the last half of the year. I mean, he was terrible for a month and a half, and then he really became maybe the steadiest guy they had. But I would imagine they got to look for upgrades in center field and in left field, unless you're looking at a straight platoon again if you keep Marsh. And then, of course, you mentioned Stott and Bohm. What are the big picture for those two guys?
I mean, again, it's something that they'll have to talk about. Like, I happen to think Bryson Stott's a winning player. I think that his defense at second base is excellent. I think he helps even when he isn't hitting because he plays such a good second base. I think there's a better hitter in there than we saw all year long. I've asked around a lot. I've talked to him a lot about why the offensive step back. Obviously, if they knew the answer, they would have fixed it. So they'll go to work on him a little bit. I still think he's a part of the future. That's just my opinion, and I think they think that too. But they did, obviously they did lose a little bit of faith in him because, he wasn't playing every day down the stretch. He was sort of a platoon second baseman. They were looking at Sosa against lefties and things like that. So, they'll have to take a look at it. I think Bohm is fascinating too. I mean, benching Bohm in game 2 to me was like, it was an eye-opener because, again, it's out of character for Rob Thompson. It tells you that they thought there was more going on there than just, he's not hitting. I don't know that they were thrilled with, early in his career, we talked a lot about Bohm in terms of like he would take a bad at-bat out to the field with him. Or, the body language wasn't good, and you could tell that he kind of, his head wasn't there, or he'd kind of taken himself out of it because of something that had happened in previous at-bat or whatever. And you saw that bubble up again, I think, in the playoffs. I mean, I thought he was going to get himself thrown out of the game yesterday there for a second when he hit that foul ball down the first baseline, and he starts, chirping at the umpire. Paco Figueroa kind of has to step in between. So he's an emotional player. Obviously, we saw what he can do through the first half of the year. He was a doubles machine. He was protection for Bryce Harper and really good protection for Bryce Harper. That's sort of like, what you want to see from Alec Bohm moving forward, and why they didn't see it down the stretch. Again, I know he had the hand injury. I'm sure that affected him to a certain extent, but you've got to find ways to get through struggles. He didn't really show that he was able to do that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a tough one. Bohm had an all-star season. He was on a pace for 100 RBI. But, yeah, I mean, there's somebody you see. I want to get your thoughts on Turner. They paid him, obviously. He's been a good player. It's not like he stinks. He's a good player. I don't know that he's a $300 million player, but are they happy with the ROI they're getting from what is he what they thought he was going to be for this lineup?
I think they do. I think they think he's the player who they thought he was. I mean, if anything, I think maybe the thing that's surprising about Trey Turner, and I don't know if they felt this way. This is how I feel, though, from watching him from afar all those years and then watching him up close. The thing that always impressed me about Trey Turner was his consistency. Obviously we didn't see him every day, so you don't know exactly how he got there. But, his numbers year in and year out are incredibly consistent. I mean, he's a 280 to 315, 320 hitter every single year. The ability, the ability is there. You know what kind of athlete he is. I think he's been less consistent than I thought he was. And maybe that's just because, look, last year was an extreme outlier, right? He was really, really bad for 3/4 of the year and then really, really good for the final quarter of the year and the postseason until the final couple of games there against Arizona. this year, I think there was a little bit more up and down than you're used to seeing. But, yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I think he's the player they thought he was. There's a reason he doesn't lead off. Remember when he got here, it was like, oh, they got their leadoff guy, right? He's got all this speed, and there's a reason he doesn't lead off. It's because he's a free swinger. He likes to hit. He likes to swing. He's going to strike out. He's going to swing at pitches out of the zone. He's going to get himself out a lot. He said last night, right? I think we beat ourselves.
Yep.
Well, I think a lot of times Trey Turner beats himself because of the kind of hitter that he is. I think that there's a book on how to get him out. And when the pitchers execute, he's going to get himself out because he's going to swing at pitches out of the zone. So, but he's a 290 to 300 hitter every year. I think he's going to run more again in the future. We'll see. To me, the biggest question for him is the position, right? I mean, how long does he stay at shortstop? Another year, another 2 years? Should he be moved now? I mean, I don't think he's obviously he's never going to win a Gold Glove. I don't think he's the worst shortstop in the league by far. I think he's better than that. But I do think he also lapses sometimes defensively. I think he's a lot more interested in being an offensive player. And, when the time comes, you're going to have to move him. And where does he go? Does he go to second? Does he go to third? Can you move him to the outfield? He played outfield briefly earlier in his career, but he's also not getting any younger. So I think that's going to be the major question going forward. I don't think they're there yet. I don't think they're looking to move him yet. But, give it another couple of years, another year, 2 years, they're going to have to face that question of how does he fit in.
I know I look at this team, and it kind of gives me the vibe of, like, after 11. They won a World Series, then they lost the World Series, then they lost in the NLCS, then they lost in the DS, and then they just fell apart. This team made it to a World Series. They lost in the Championship Series. Now they've lost in the DS. I don't know if they're going to fall apart as rapidly as that team did, but you do have some aging guys. Do they try to jump out ahead and say, if we can move a JT, I know that sounds nuts because, they don't really have a catcher in the system. Marchand, I guess, but he's never healthy. Castellanos has 2 years left on the deal. You're obviously not moving Harper or Turner. But is there a tradable guy that, they might jump out ahead of?
I don't know. I mean, it's it's going to be difficult. It's like, you mentioned Castellanos, and number one, right? He had a really good second half. Like you said, he was maybe their most consistent hitter, as crazy as that sounds, because he's a streaky player. But he's got 2 years left at $20 million per. You're going to have to pick up some of that money. He's certainly, I think, more valuable to you on your roster than on someone else's if you're footing part of the bill. So I don't know. I really don't, and I think that's what makes it hard. That's what makes it difficult. Is like they've got obvious holes or they've got obvious flaws, and they've got to fix them. But how do you fix them when you have $220 million tied up in 11 players to start the year, and that's before you get into the arbitration guys who are all going to get raises. And the good thing, I suppose, is that the owner has shown no willingness to roll a payroll back. If anything, he's probably going to continue to add, and they'll have to try to figure it out. But I do think, look, offensively, they're going to have to try to, as I said, sort of reconfigure things, figure out how do we balance the lineup, because we have a lot of the same type of hitter. How do we balance, I'm just to put the name out there because he's not going to be available, but how do you find a guy like Luis Arraez, right, who puts the bat on the ball, never strikes out, keeps the line moving, gets on base a lot? They don't have a guy like that.
Yeah.
And can you find a guy like that who can do that and bring a different skill set to the group? Ideally, it would be a left fielder or a center fielder who you could find. Stephen Kwan is a guy in Cleveland who's that type of hitter, and you see what he was able to do with that, to bring that dimension to that offense this year in Cleveland. Can you find that sort of a player who can fit into your lineup, preferably in left field or center field, and maybe give you a dynamic that you don't have now? And, if it's the right guy and that guy plays well next year, it could make a big difference. So I just think it's trying to figure out, their solution last year was, okay, we'll beef up our hitting department. We'll go to work on these guys. We'll get them to chase less. Well, zebras don't change their stripes, right?
Yep.
So Like Nick Castellanos is not suddenly going to start to chase less, and neither is Trey Turner. And so you've got to kind of work around what you've got. And that's why I say, like, you got to look at a player like Marsh, and you got to say, like, is this guy, in a different lineup might be just fine, being the player that he is. But he strikes out 32% of the time. He's a platoon outfielder. Can we find a left-handed hitting outfielder who does some things that Brandon Marsh doesn't do, and put the lineup together that way?
All right, my last one would be, is it a fait accompli in your mind, Lauber, that the manager's back?
Boy, I think so. I think he is. I'll say this. So I've covered Dave Dombrowski in a couple of places now, Boston and here. And, the Red Sox won the division in 2016 and 2017, lost in the first round both times. And he fired John Farrell and he brought in Alex Cora. They end up winning the World Series in 2018, and it had a lot to do with a lot of factors, not just Alex Cora, but, that was one of the moves he chose to make at that time, was to say, like, look, we're not getting over the hump with the manager we have. Maybe we need a different voice. I don't think he's there yet with Rob Thompson. I'd be surprised if he is. But, when you're in a situation where you've got a roster that's pretty inflexible, it's a lot easier to change the manager than it is to change the roster. So I never say never. I never rule anything out, but I don't think that they're at that place yet. I don't think that Rob Thompson's the fall guy for this. He's a manager, so you're going to be able to second guess any number of decisions that any manager makes, but I don't think he's the reason why they've taken a step back the last couple of years. And the other thing too, like, not for nothing, right? Alex Cora just signed an extension with the Red Sox. He's not going to be available. I'm not sure who you go find to replace Rob Thompson, who's going to be better than Rob Thompson and get more out of this group. So I know the players like him. I know that they play hard for him, and I think he's going to end up being back. But don't rule anything out.
All right, Scott Lauber, there you go. The Phillies fall 3-1 to the Mets. From the Philadelphia Inquirer, at Scott Lauber for all of the offseason coverage. It should be an interesting offseason. And, of course, spring training. February, we'll be walking our way all the way back to the Phillies. They're starting to get that Sixer vibe around them. You bring this group back again. We'll see if the fans are still kind of excited about this team. But, Scott, we appreciate you as always, man. We'll talk to you in the offseason.
Okay, Mike. Thanks.